What happens when a CEO orders a meal at his own diner and discovers the truth behind the smiles? Jacob Reed, the CEO of a small diner chain with 13 locations, had built his business from the ground up over the past decade. He took pride in creating a family-friendly atmosphere, but lately, something felt off. Customer complaints about slow service and rude staff were piling up, and employee turnover was at an all-time high. His regional managers kept assuring him that everything was fine, but the reports didn't match the whispers he had been hearing. Frustrated and determined to see the truth for himself, Jacob decided to go undercover. He picked a diner in a suburban town 2 hours away from his corporate office, far enough that no one would recognize him. Most of his employees had never met him in person. To blend in, he grew out a scruffy beard, swapped his tailored suits for a worn-out hoodie and jeans, and put on thick-rimmed glasses. He looked nothing like the polished executive featured on the company website. Jacob walked into the diner at lunchtime. The place was buzzing with chatter and the clinking of dishes. The dining area was clean but felt outdated, with slightly worn booths. It wasn't terrible, but it didn't have the warm, welcoming atmosphere he had envisioned when he started the company. A young waitress with tired eyes approached him, her name tag reading Megan. "Hi there, welcome," she said with a cheerful but strained smile. "Can I get you something to drink?" Jacob noticed the faint bags under her eyes and the hesitation in her smile. Something about her seemed off, but he brushed it aside. "Just coffee, thanks," he said, sliding into a booth by the window. Megan nodded and hurried off, weaving between tables with practiced efficiency. Jacob watched as she juggled multiple orders, refilled drinks, and cleared plates. She was clearly overworked, but she never showed frustration to the customers. When she returned with his coffee, he ordered a burger and fries. As she scribbled on her notepad, a loud voice boomed from the kitchen. "Megan, what's taking so long? You're falling behind again." Jacob glanced toward the kitchen. The voice belonged to a short, stocky man in his 40s, wearing a stained apron. Jacob guessed he was the shift manager. He hadn't introduced himself when Jacob walked in, something Jacob took note of. Megan flinched at the harsh tone but quickly nodded. "Coming right up," she called back, her voice cracking slightly. Jacob frowned. He had built his business on the idea that employees should feel valued, not berated in front of customers. As he sipped his coffee, he listened to the conversations around him. A family at the booth behind him complained about waiting too long for their meal. 2 teenagers whispered about how rude the manager had been to their waitress earlier. The atmosphere felt tense, far from the friendly diner experience Jacob had worked so hard to create. When Megan brought out his burger, she apologized for the delay. "Sorry about the wait," she said softly, avoiding eye contact. "No worries," Jacob replied with a small smile. "You're doing great." Her eyes flicked up, surprised, before she nodded and hurried away. Jacob had barely taken a bite when he heard muffled sobbing from the kitchen. He froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. The sound grew louder, unmistakable now. It was Megan. He set his fork down and strained to listen. "I'm trying my best, okay?" Her voice cracked. "I haven't had a break in 6 hours, and I'm doing everything I can." The manager's voice cut in, dismissive and sharp. "If you can't handle the pressure, maybe you're in the wrong job. We don't have time for excuses." Jacob's stomach twisted. He couldn't sit still. Sliding out of the booth, leaving his half-eaten burger behind, he walked toward the kitchen door. What he saw made his chest tighten. Megan stood with trembling hands, wiping her eyes on her sleeve. The manager loomed over her, arms crossed, his face twisted in frustration. 2 cooks stood nearby, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to step in. Jacob clenched his fists, his heart pounding. This wasn't the company he had built. "Is there a problem here?" Jacob asked, his voice calm but firm. The manager turned, startled. No, just a little miscommunication." Megan shook her head, tears still in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Jacob looked at her, then back at the manager. He didn't reveal who he was just yet. Instead, he said, "She looks like she needs a break. Why don't you let her sit down for a few minutes?" The manager scoffed. "We're short-staffed. There's no time for breaks during the rush." Jacob's jaw tightened. There's always time to treat people with respect. Tension thickened in the air. Jacob held the manager's gaze, knowing he couldn't stay silent much longer. Before the manager could respond, one of the cooks, a wiry young man with nervous energy, spoke up. Megan's been nonstop since she clocked in. She hasn't even had time to grab a drink of water. His voice was hesitant but held quiet defiance. The manager shot him a glare. Stay out of it, Connor. Focus on your station. Jacob's eyes flicked to Connor, then back to the manager. And who's in charge of making sure your team can focus? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like the real problem is how this place is being run. The manager's face flushed, his confidence faltering for the first time. Rick folded his arms. Look, I'm just doing my job. If people can't handle it, that's not on me. Jacob's gaze hardened. We'll see about that. Megan, still wiping her eyes, glanced at Jacob with confusion and a hint of gratitude. I'll be fine, she muttered, though her voice wavered. She turned toward the door, but Jacob gently stopped her. Take 5, he said softly. You've earned it. The manager started to protest, but Jacob held up a hand, his tone firm. She's taking a break. Now, Megan hesitated, glancing nervously between Jacob and Rick, before nodding and slipping past the swinging kitchen doors. Jacob turned back to Rick, his voice calm but steely. What's your name? Rick. The man replied defensively. And who are you to come in here and tell me how to run my shift? Jacob ignored the question. How long have you been the manager here, Rick? Rick scoffed. About 2 years. And I've kept this place running just fine, so I don't need some random customer stepping in. Jacob's expression darkened. And you call this fine? His voice rose slightly. Your staff is overworked, your customers are complaining, and you're berating people in the middle of their shifts. That's not fine. It's a mess. Rick opened his mouth to argue, but Jacob cut him off. You might want to think about how you're treating people, because I guarantee if I were your boss, this wouldn't fly. Rick's face paled slightly, but he quickly tried to mask it with a scoff. Right. Well, you're not my boss, so. Before he could finish, the kitchen doors swung open. Megan reappeared, looking slightly more composed. She kept her head down as she walked past Rick and back into the dining area. Jacob decided it was time to step back and observe again. For now, he gave Rick one last pointed look before following Megan out. Back at his booth, Jacob watched as Megan returned to her routine. She moved a little slower now, her exhaustion more obvious, but she still managed a small smile for every customer she served. He noticed her taking extra care with a young mother struggling to keep her toddler entertained, offering crayons and a paper menu for the child to color on. He also noticed Rick glaring at her from the kitchen window. Jacob pulled out his phone and discreetly started taking notes. Rick's behavior, Megan's workload, customer complaints. He also made note of Connor, the cook who had stood up for Megan. After finishing his meal, Jacob flagged Megan down. Can I get the check? He asked lightly. She nodded and quickly brought it over. Thanks for stopping by. Sorry again about earlier, she said quietly. No need to apologize, Jacob replied, slipping some cash into the billfold. You're doing great. Her cheeks flushed slightly, and she offered a small, genuine smile. Thank you. As she walked away, Jacob made a decision. He wasn't done here. Not by a long shot. He stood, grabbed his jacket, and made his way to the door. But before leaving, he paused and glanced back at the dining room. Megan was refilling a customer's coffee, her movements careful but efficient. Rick was barking orders at Connor in the kitchen. Jacob's jaw tightened. He pushed open the door and stepped outside, pulling out his phone. Janet, he said when his assistant answered. Clear my schedule for tomorrow and get me everything we have on the staff at the suburb name location. Employee files, performance reviews, all of it. Got it, Janet replied without hesitation. Anything else? Jacob glanced back at the diner one last time before walking to his car. Yeah, he said. Make sure my regional managers are ready for a meeting. We need to talk. He hung up and slid into the driver's seat, his mind already racing with plans. Tomorrow, Jacob wasn't just going to observe. He was going to take action. The next morning, Jacob arrived at the diner just after opening, wearing the same scruffy disguise as the day before. This time, he carried a small notebook in his pocket and a renewed sense of determination. The morning shift was quieter, giving him a chance to observe without the chaos of a lunch rush. Megan was already on the floor, moving deliberately but slower than yesterday. She looked even more drained, her smile thinner. Rick wasn't in sight yet, but Connor was in the kitchen, prepping ingredients. Jacob waited until Megan passed by with a coffee pot before calling her over. "Hey, Megan," he said casually. "Got a second?" She hesitated, glancing at the few customers scattered around the diner. Sure, but I can't stay long. We're short-staffed again." "I won't keep you," Jacob promised. "I just wanted to ask, how long have you been working here?" She blinked, clearly caught off guard. "About 8 months." "Why?" Jacob leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "You seem like you're carrying a lot on your shoulders. Is it always this busy?" Megan hesitated, her eyes darting toward the kitchen window. "It's not always the customers," she murmured. "Sometimes it's—" She trailed off, biting her lip. "It's Rick, isn't it?" Jacob asked gently. Her head snapped up, panic flashing across her face. "I shouldn't." "You don't have to say anything," Jacob interrupted, keeping his voice soft. "I just want to understand what it's like for you here." Megan hesitated again, then sighed. "It's not just him. It's everything. We're always short-staffed, and when things get hectic, he just makes it worse. I know he's under pressure too, but it feels like we're always the ones paying for it." Jacob nodded, his mind racing. He decided to push a little further. "What about Connor? He seems like he tries to help." Megan's expression softened slightly. "Connor's great. He's only been here a few months, but he's one of the few people who actually cares. He covers for people when they're struggling. Honestly, if it weren't for him, I probably would have quit by now." Before Jacob could ask more, the kitchen door swung open and Rick strode out. The energy in the room shifted immediately. Megan's shoulders tensed, and she quickly excused herself to refill a customer's coffee. Rick didn't seem to notice Jacob as he barked instructions at Connor, who nodded silently while dicing vegetables. Jacob's jaw tightened as he watched. This wasn't just stress. This was a pattern. He let the morning play out, silently taking note of every interaction, every frustrated glance, every moment of tension. Today wasn't just about watching. It was about deciding what happened next. Despite the tension, by the time the lunch rush began, the diner was back to its usual chaotic pace. Megan was once again running between tables, balancing plates and refilling drinks with practiced efficiency. It wasn't long before the first incident occurred. An older man in a flannel shirt flagged Megan down, frowning at his plate. "These eggs are overcooked," he grumbled. Megan offered a polite, apologetic smile. "I'm really sorry about that. I can have the kitchen remake them for you." The man huffed. "How about just doing your job right the first time?" Megan's face flushed, but she kept her composure. "I'll get it fixed right away." Before she could turn toward the kitchen, Rick stormed out. "What's the problem here?" he demanded, his glare fixed on Megan. The customer waved him off. "It's fine. She's handling it." Rick ignored him, narrowing his eyes at Megan. "How many times do I have to tell you to double-check orders before they go out? This is basic stuff." The words hit like a slap. Megan stiffened, her knuckles whitening around her notepad. Jacob stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The sharp sound cut through the room, silencing the low hum of conversation. "That's enough," he said firmly. Rick turned to him, scowling. "And who the hell do you think you are?" Jacob didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and flipped it open to reveal his company ID. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the authority behind it. "I'm Jacob Reed," he said, locking eyes with Rick. "I own this diner, and 13 others just like it." The room fell silent. Megan froze mid-step, her eyes wide. Connor peeked out from the kitchen, his knife still in hand. Even the customers seemed to hold their breath. Rick's face went pale, then flushed red. I didn't realize." "No," Jacob cut him off. "You didn't. Because if you had, you wouldn't be treating my staff like this. Or my customers." Rick opened his mouth, but Jacob didn't give him a chance to recover. "Let's talk." In the back. His voice was sharp, leaving no room for argument. Rick hesitated, then gave a stiff nod and turned toward the kitchen. Jacob followed but paused as he passed Megan. "I won't let this slide," he murmured. Then he stepped into the office, closing the door behind him. Inside, Jacob turned to Rick, his expression unreadable. "Do you have any idea how out of line you've been?" His voice was low, firm. Rick swallowed. Jacob held up a hand. "Save it. I've seen enough. You've been here for 2 years, and in that time, you've managed to create a toxic work environment. Do you know what that does to morale? To customer service? To this business?" Rick dropped his gaze, his bravado crumbling. "I get it," he muttered. "This job isn't easy, but that doesn't give you the right to treat people the way you do." Rick swallowed hard. I can do better. You're done," Jacob interrupted, his voice final. Rick's head snapped up, eyes wide. "Wait, you can't." "I can," Jacob said, "and I will." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "HR will process your severance package, but as of right now, you're no longer part of this company." Rick stood frozen for a moment before nodding stiffly. Without another word, he turned and walked out. Jacob sighed, letting the weight of the moment settle. He didn't like firing people, but sometimes it was necessary. When he stepped back into the dining area, all eyes were on him. Megan and Connor stood near the kitchen, their expressions a mix of shock and cautious hope. The customers, too, watched curiously, murmuring among themselves. Jacob took a deep breath. "I want to thank everyone for their hard work," he said, his voice steady. "Things are going to change around here. Starting today." He looked directly at Megan and Connor. "You two, meet me after your shift. We need to talk." The tension in the room began to ease, replaced by a quiet buzz of curiosity and relief. Jacob knew this was just the beginning, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was steering his company in the right direction. Later that night, the last customer had left, the lights had dimmed, and the hum of the kitchen appliances filled the silence. Megan and Connor stood by the counter, waiting. They looked exhausted but more at ease than before. There was something else in their expressions, too, cautious hope. Jacob had spent the rest of the day observing without interfering further, but now it was time to act. "All right, let's sit," he said, motioning to a booth near the back. He slid into one side. Megan and Connor hesitated before sitting across from him. Jacob leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "First, I want to say thank you." His voice was firm but sincere. "I know today was rough, especially with everything going on, but you handled yourselves with professionalism and care. That's more than I can say for some of the leadership this place has had." Megan glanced at Connor, unsure how to respond. Connor fidgeted with the edge of his apron. Jacob exhaled. "I didn't know things had gotten this bad," he admitted, his voice softer now. "That's on me. I've been too distant. I built this company to be a place where people feel valued, employees and customers. And somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that." Megan hesitated, then spoke. "It's not all bad," she said quietly. "I mean, I've worked worse jobs. But it's been hard." She glanced down at her hands. "I do love the customers, though. I just wish." She trailed off, unsure if she should say more. Jacob studied her for a moment. "Wish what?" She bit her lip. Then, after a pause, she finally said it. "I just wish it felt like someone cared." Jacob nodded slowly. "Well," he said, "starting now, someone does. You know, like someone actually cared." Megan hesitated, then exhaled. "Really cared. Not just about numbers or how fast we can turn tables, but about us." Jacob nodded, letting her words sink in. "And you, Connor?" he asked gently. Connor looked up, his voice quiet but steady. "Honestly, I didn't plan to stay long, but I couldn't leave. Not with everything Megan and the others have to deal with. Someone had to have their back." Jacob felt a pang of guilt. These two had been holding this place together while he sat in an office, trusting reports and spreadsheets. That ended now. "Things are going to change," Jacob said firmly. "For real. And I'm not just going to tell you. I'm going to show you." Megan and Connor exchanged cautious glances. Curiosity flickered in their eyes, mixed with something else, hope. "Here's what's going to happen," Jacob continued. "First, I'm bringing in a new manager. Someone with experience, but also someone who knows how to lead with respect. Until then, I'll personally oversee things here and make sure we get back on track." Megan's eyes widened. "You're staying?" Jacob nodded. "For as long as it takes." Connor tilted his head. "And Rick?" "He's not coming back," Jacob said simply. "I don't tolerate that kind of behavior." "And neither should you." Connor let out a small breath of relief. Megan's shoulders sagged, as if a weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying had finally lifted. "Second," Jacob went on, "I'm revisiting the staffing structure. No more being short-staffed during peak hours. We'll hire more people, and I'll make sure everyone gets proper breaks. You can't take care of customers if you're running on empty." Megan gave a small, grateful smile. "That would be amazing." Jacob nodded. "And third, I want to reward the two of you for everything you've done to keep this place afloat." Megan and Connor exchanged startled looks. "Reward us?" Megan asked cautiously. Jacob nodded. "Connor, you've shown incredible loyalty and leadership even in the short time you've been here. I'm promoting you to assistant manager. You'll get a raise and more consistent hours." Connor's jaw dropped. "Wait, are you serious? I've never managed anything before." Jacob smiled. "You already are. You've been stepping up when no one else would. That's what leadership is." Connor blinked, stunned. I don't know what to say." "Thank you." Jacob turned to Megan. "And you, Megan. 8 months of dedication, even when things were at their worst. I see how much you care about the customers and your coworkers. You deserve more than just a pat on the back." Megan's eyes shimmered, and she quickly looked down, embarrassed. "I'm just doing my job." "You're doing more than that," Jacob said gently. "Starting next week, I'm giving you a significant pay raise. And I want to set up a bonus system so hard work like yours gets recognized." Megan's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God. Really?" Jacob smiled. "Really?" For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of his words sinking in. Then Megan whispered, "Thank you. I mean it. Thank you." Jacob leaned back, his expression softening. "You've earned it." In the following weeks, Jacob kept his promise. He spent several days at the diner, working alongside the staff, listening. He personally interviewed candidates for the manager position, eventually hiring a woman named Denise, whose experience and empathetic leadership quickly won over the team. True to his word, he approved raises for Megan and Connor, brought in 3 new hires to ease the workload, and implemented real changes: better scheduling, updated equipment, and regular team meetings to make sure everyone had a voice. The atmosphere in the diner transformed. Customers noticed it too. Service was faster, the energy lighter. The staff wasn't just working, they actually seemed happy to be there. One afternoon, as Jacob prepared to leave for the corporate office, Megan stopped him by the door. "Hey," she said, smiling. "I just wanted to say, this place feels different now. Better. Like it actually matters." Jacob smiled. "It does matter. And so do you." As he walked to his car, a sense of pride settled over him, one he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about profits or expansion anymore. It was about the people who made it all possible. And he wasn't going to forget that again. And that, right there, is what real leadership looks like. Jacob could have stayed in his office, crunching numbers, trusting reports. But instead, he showed up. He listened. He changed things. And maybe that's the real takeaway here. Because how many times have we all been in a place like this? Stuck in a job where it feels like no one cares? Where you're just another number on a spreadsheet? But imagine if more people, more leaders, actually paid attention. If they saw the real value in the people holding everything together. This story isn't just about Jacob, Megan, or Connor. It's about all of us. So let me ask you this. Have you ever worked a job where you felt invisible? Where you gave it your all, but no one noticed? Tell me your story in the comments. I read them. I see you, and I want to hear your experiences. And if this story hit home, if you believe more people need to hear this, then do me a favor. Like this video to show your support. Comment below with your thoughts or your own experiences. Subscribe if you want more stories that actually mean something. Because this channel, it's not just about stories. It's about real moments that remind us why people matter. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next.